we've got the first talk coming up by Iannish. He is a senior product designer at What Three Words. Morning, Iannish. How are you doing?
Morning.
Listen, I believe you've got something exciting for us to tell how you have designed something accessible for What Three Words. Tell us the secret.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to it.
Go for it. Thank you so much.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Let's talk accessibility. All right, so the reason why I've called this talk accessibility for everyone is because I want to make the case for accessibility to all of you as a weapon that benefits all users. You know, it's a weapon for design, I think, that where people tend to think of accessibility as this thing, as an afterthought. I really want to make the case that actually accessibility can be something that benefits everyone. All right, so let's go through a little overview. So in this talk, we're going to go through the barriers to design for accessibility, why I think the 20% is a little bit misleading. When you ignore the issues, how bad can it get? And I think it can get pretty bad. Where do you start your journey? I think accessibility is one of those things, a bit like a design system, to be honest with you, where you're not really ever at the pinnacle of it. It's only ever developing. And the last piece I want to touch on is testing, iterating, improving, forever improving your products when it comes to accessibility, and a few of the things that our users said. Okay, so let's start off with a broad definition of what is accessibility. There are many definitions out there, but this is the one I've chosen because I think it makes accessibility the most accessible for people who you work with and the stakeholders who will give you sign-off to be able to work on these areas of your product. And that is, accessibility is the degree to which a product, device, service, or environment is available to as many people as possible. And I think the first barrier that you'll encounter when you pitch this to any of your stakeholders is, guys, look, we've got a budget priority list here. Let's put this accessibility thing on the backlog. In fact, at the beginning, we'll think about putting at the backlog of the backlog at the very bottom of it on ice. So that's kind of what I think the perception is of accessibility, and we need to change that. The second piece here is that it's only for the 20%. So there's approximately 20% of the population that has a impairment of some kind. And if we do all this work, it may benefit our users, but only to a certain extent, and we don't know what portion of them are really have an accessibility issue. I'm not so sure I want to do it. That is wrong. That is, I'm going to say that, refute that straight away. That is wrong perception to have. And the third one is, okay, I'm sold. But where do I start? I've got no clue at all about where I'm going to start with this journey at all. Don't worry, I got you covered. So I think I'll give you an example of how we started, okay? We started to take a little bit more of a holistic approach. And to be honest with you, it's kind of unintentional. At What Three Words, we are trying to solve the problem of addressing. Addressing comes in many shapes and sizes. And if you were to say, okay, what is a global addressing system? It is kind of longitude and latitude. It is the series of numbers that are placed around the globe. And if you get maybe one digit of those wrong, you could end up on the opposite side of the planet. It is not very easy to use. The second one is things like the duplication of addresses themselves. So if I give you an example, in London alone, there are more than 9 church roads, which makes it almost impossible to kind of go, okay, this is my specific address. And the last one, and it's the reason that's closest to my heart, at least the reason why I joined What Three Words, is it genuinely changes livelihoods. And what I mean by that is this picture here is a picture of where I grew up. It's in South Africa. And what you have here is a split between the rich areas and the poor areas. If you have the benefit of living in the rich areas, you kind of got a paved road with an address that's given to you, which works brilliantly, which works really well. But the problem is that if you are born on the opposite side and you don't have those privileges, it means that you don't have the luxury of someone giving you an address, which means that it's not just you're not going to get pizza in 30 minutes when it delivers to you on time. It also means that you're not going to get things like a bank account. It means that you're not going to get proof of address. It means that you're not going to be able to get a job. Addresses have real impacts on people. So our mission at What 3 Words is really to make a global standard of addressing more accessible. And the way we've done that is by taking the entire planet and dividing it into 3 by 3 meters squared. And in each square, there is a unique 3-word address, 3 simple words for anywhere on the planet. Now, the reason why we chose words is because it's more accessible. So as an example of what you can technically do right now is you can type these words, of course, and it will give you that address as a recognized address. You can say this through like voice UIs, and it will recognize those 3-word addresses. But you can also even scan it. You can scan these 3 words, and it will recognize it as an address. Now, the other thing that we've done for accessibility, and again, I do stress about this point of like, okay, we are trying to make this address more accessible because it's a better product, period, not because it's this tiny piece of our user base that needs it. It's broadly more accessible. And it is available, every single 3-word address, such as here, Daring Lion Race, is available in 47 different languages. That makes it feel localized, but it makes it more accessible because the internet's growing and there are more and more people that the internet is distributed to that isn't in English. Okay, so my point to you about this, and other than pitching What 3 Words to you, is that I think we need to reframe our thinking when it comes to accessibility. It is good for everyone. So other examples I can give you here are, for example, with color contrasts, right? Over here, we've got a piece of text that is working quite badly. And I can still read it more or less, but with someone who has a visual impairment probably won't be able to read it at all. So, of course, you up the color contrast and you look at trying to make it a bit more legible. But this is not just good for people who have visual impairment. This is great for me as well, and everyone else. Another thing is closed captions, or subtitles in videos. Yes, for someone who is hard of hearing, yes, it's absolutely imperative that they can digest that content. But when I'm back on the tube, and that will happen when we are all back on the tube, and we're putting in our headphones, and we have to rummage our bag to watch a 10-second video, you don't really want to do that. For a 10-second video, I just want to see the content straight away, so it benefits everyone. And another area here is things like keyboard navigation. Yes, it helps someone who has a motor impairment. But on top of all of that, anybody here who uses any kind of application, whether it's design or development, will know that keyboard shortcuts basically make everything a lot easier and simpler to use. All right. Let's talk a little bit about what happens when you ignore accessibility completely. So there's this interesting website, and I think the intention of this website is to create the worst possible website on the planet. And I think what they have done unintentionally is create the worst experience of accessibility on the web. So if we quickly jump into this, what we're looking at here is, it looks like a normal website, but the problem here is that there's no H1s, no H2, nothing is tagged. So any kind of accessibility software that you place on top of it will be very, very difficult to actually read any of this for someone who's hard of hearing or someone who's blind. Also, there are basic things like, for example, this text is completely illegible. If you pass it through any kind of software where you need to check some accessibility ratings, it will fail. The other thing is that the obvious things, and again, people don't classify this as part of accessibility, but it is an part of accessibility ratings, is the main call to action is a big fat no, and it does nothing. But only if you manage to read, please click here, and the click that is underlined doesn't work itself. And you click on here itself, you kind of go to the next page. Okay, after they have fired a shotgun of colors in your face, you realize that once I've entered my my password, it's called password blah blah blah. Again, you're noticing the field, I have to select all the different elements. And if I enter something that's wrong, it doesn't tell me immediately. I have to actually submit it. But when I've submitted it, it doesn't even give me any kind of error message or indication as to what went wrong. Then eventually you realize, okay, I need to go through all these to understand what's happening. look, I'm not going to bore you with going through all these today, but what I think would be really good is if you could try. I've asked my team at What Three Words to try this. Is to try and pass this website. There's 4 different pages to it. I know nobody who's actually finished and gone through all the way through to the end. All right, let's move on. How do you start your journey of accessibility? Honestly, there's no golden bullet. I think there are many different ways of approaching it. I think just start is my point. And I think the other way, the best framework that I think we used was these 4 principles. And let's run you through what those 4 principles are. I think when we started to look at all the different areas, we noticed that there was tons of gray area and lots of places where there are areas that kind of overlap. And I think that makes sense because it's such a broad field of trying to classify exactly what accessibility is. So the first principle we looked at was perceivable principles. So these are things, but not limited to, these are things like font sizes, color contrasts, video captions. As an example of this, it allows you to kind of, one example of this is just checking to see whether your colors work well on your page. So I'm going to give you a quick example of how this works using a really cool plugin called Colorblindly. So what Colorblindly allows you to do is it allows you to simulate some colorblind or sort of some types of visual impairments rather. They're not all of them, but some of them. And it just allows you to check to see if your styles are working at a system level to make sure that when you do use your colors in many different parts of your product, you are still maintaining that same color hierarchy that you think you are. All right, let's move on to the next one. The operable principle. The operable principle is things like menu systems, keyboard navigation, and media controls. So as an example of this, I'm going to show you a little bit about what keyboard navigation means. So keyboard navigation is, so to test this, we use something called the Accessibility Insights plugin. And I highly recommend this because it's very comprehensive. You can do something called a fast pass, which gives you the basics and automates a lot of the testing for you. Or you can do an assessment, which for me was the best way that I learned about all the different areas of accessibility in a practical sense of the word. So let's do a little quick test here. All right, so I'm going to continue from my previous one. I'm going to have a look at some keyboard navigation. Let's turn that on. Now, what it allows you to do is it allows you to simulate how someone who has got a motor impairment and can only use one button will navigate through your website. And you'll be able to test to see if I can hit enter and kind of go through it and navigate it that way. That is one example of the operable principle. The understandable principle is an interesting one because believe it or not, readable language is one of the accessibility criteria. You need to make sure that whatever text you're putting on your website is not just chucked on there. It should be easy to read. There are things like component states and input assistance. So to give you an example of that, let's have a look at a form. So here, let's put in my first name, let's put in my second name, and then I think to make the point, like contrary to the previous form that we saw earlier, if I put in my email address and maybe a few other letters that don't work well, straight away, it tells me there's an error here. And that's important for 2 reasons. One, it just gives UI practice, but also it gives information for any other sort of technologies that are sitting on top for someone who has an impairment that can understand what exactly the problem is. All right, let's talk about the robust principle a little bit. These are things like alt text, component tagging, and status messages. And to give you an example of that, I'm going to play for you a little video of how we have tried. And by the way, like we're not experts in accessibility, but we are trying our best here. This is an example of how we've tagged all the components inside of our app to try and make it easy to read for someone who's using TalkBack, as an example, which is it's a tool for people who are blind to be able to use.